Strategies for Change, the importance of the social model of disability with visiting Professor Colin Barnes.
I am Colin Barnes. I'm Professor Emeritus Emeritus means that I'm a professor for life because of the contributions I did, although I retired several years ago. But having said that, I am not a non-disabled person. I was born blind, basically. I had congenital cataract, and when I was 6 months old, I had a needling operation, which means they put a hole through your lenses in your eyes. So you've got no lenses that actually work, and you just got a hole to the back of your eye, essentially. Anyway, the upshot was that I was in special schools till I was 11. Both my parents were disabled. My father was a visually impaired man with the same condition as me, and my mother suffered several nervous breakdowns, which eventually resulted in severe mental illness. But both my parents were lovely people, so I grew up with disability. I was never brought up to feel different at all. Both my parents understood what the world was about, and they knew that it wasn't a problem of individuals, it was a problem of the way society was organised. My father worked in a sheltered workshop for blind people, and my mother was in and out of hospitals for a lot of her life, basically. But otherwise, I had a great childhood. I hated special schools. I went to ordinary school when I was 11, and it was the best school I ever went. The interesting thing, it was a secondary modern school, and I never saw the blackboard all the time I was there. So it was an interesting experience. I left school at 15. I went to work in the catering industry for several years. I left school with no qualifications at all, but did some extra work at night school while I was working, got some 3 O-levels, and left catering in 1980 and went to teacher training college to teach disabled kids how not to be disabled, because up until I lived in a non-disabled world with a severe visual impairment most of my life. So adjusting to society was not a problem, basically, for me. So in a sense, I knew what the social model was all about because I'd been brought up with it, having to live in a world for sighted people, basically. Basically, it was a course on learning and life skills, basically, how to use banks, how to organise their time, how to enlist support of other people without being patronised, and so on and so forth. And there was a chap there who was very interested in what I was doing, and he suggested, well, why don't you do something about it rather than just go teach young people? There's nothing wrong with that, but you might be able to do more if you get higher qualifications. So I all this time I'd been working with a group of young disabled people in Leeds called the Contact Group, which was an interesting organisation because these people were aged between 16 and 30 odd, 32 I think was the oldest. And they were moved from one day centre to the other for 5 days a week because they didn't have any facilities for young disabled people there in Leeds. So they were going from one day centre for older people each day, different day centres, and the idea was that they were doing activities and so on, and we were trying to teach them how to be active citizens and stuff, because one of the things that was important was that these kids had nowhere else to go in Leeds. That was all there was for young disabled young men. So at the same time, I applied to go to Leeds University. I went to Leeds University to the Department of Sociology, and I was interviewed by a chap called Robert Towler, and he said, "Why do you want to do sociology?" And I said, "I want to do disability," basically. And he just looked at me and said, "Disability?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, you're in, but you'll have to pass an exam. So I did 3 years at Leeds University as an undergraduate in 1982 and produced a dissertation called The Sociology of Disability, Discrimination and Disabled People, which was profoundly inspired by the emergent disabled people's movement, because 1981 was the International Year of Disabled People, believe it or not. And there's a conference in South America for the first international conference for DPI, which is Disabled People's International. And it was brought together 40 organizations from disabled people all over the world. And that was very influential. And the 1980s was the International Decade of Disabled People, believe it or not. But the interesting thing about that conference was that there was an English organization called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation that came together in 1974. Now, this was an organization of disabled people who've been in long-term institutions, residential schools and residential hospitals. And they were all activists who decided to think about what disability was. And they came to the conclusion that the only way that you could do this was to define disablement in a particular way, which meant splitting individual impairments from society's responses to people with impairments. They decided that language should be split into two. Impairments was about bodily and mind problems, in inverted commas. But disability was the problems created by society that didn't recognize that people had differences. Now, the important point here is that impairment is not something that's peculiar to this section of the community or that section of the community. It affects most people. The majority of causes of impairment, whether it be not being able to walk, not being able to see, not being able to hear, not being able to think properly, occur after birth. Very few people in the whole scheme of things are born with impairments at the start of life, unlike people like me. You know, most people become blind as they get older or have an accident, go to warvid, which leave them with various conditions. So impairment is a fact of life. It's not an inevitable outcome of the life course, but it's likely to occur for most people who live long enough. I mean, I've been visually impaired for all my life. Now I'm older, I'm losing my hearing because that's what's part of the aging process. So impairment is a common experience, but disablement isn't. Although it's true to say that impairment can affect anybody, whether they're rich or poor, the reality is, of course, that it's easier for rich people to deal with it than it is for poor people. And the majority of disabled people are poor. And the important thing here is that we can change things to make life easier for disabled people or people with impairments. And that is what the social model is about. The social model is nothing more than using any means possible to change people's lives, making it easier, normalizing the reality of impairment. For example, ramps instead of steps, access to large print, braille, or any form of communication that people who don't normally see or hear can access easily. Now, a lot of this has come through technology, but there are attitudes about impairment that are still prominent within society. So the problems of disability are changing, but they are still there. And the social model is all about changing those disabling barriers, if you like, whatever form they take, whether they be physical, whether they be cultural, or whether they be interactional with other people. That's what disability activism is all about. And coming back to the language, this has implications for how we describe ourselves. If I say, well, I'm a person with a disability, that implies that the responsibility for coming to terms with disability is mine, not society's. Also, by identifying as a disabled person, it means you are becoming part of the movement for change. Because being a disabled person and adopting a social model of approach, eventually, in one way or another, has to become, in inverted commas, political, whether that be on a grand scale or whether that be on an individual level. Because politics is not just simply about parties, parliament, politicians, and so on. It's everyday life. In a household, there are politics, paternal politics, maternal politics, and so on. So politics are all around. And if you identify as a disabled person, it means you're not necessarily ashamed of having a disabling, in inverted commas, condition, such as an impairment. So there's much to do with this sort of issue about disability and disablement. And it's so easy to fall into the situation where you feel responsible for your impairment and your difficulties. But these are difficulties about society. Now, it is true to say that you cannot solve everything by technological means and physical means, like ramps, widening doors, technology assisting devices. At the end of the day, there are some people who need personal assistance, or what, in inverted commas, politicians called carers and charities and so on. The reality is that while disabled people supposedly are more dependent than other people, everybody is dependent in some way. Human beings are not individuals. We are individuals in a sense, in the fact that we're all different, but we are different. The only way we can define our difference is by looking at other people. Individuals cannot survive on their own. And if you think about personal assistance, to say a wheelchair user, for example, Jane Campbell, very good friend of mine, she employs something like 4 people a week because she's physically impaired and she needs personal assistance. Ordinary people will look at Jane and say how disabled she is, how terrible that is. But the interesting thing here, of course, is that the more wealthy you become and the more powerful you become, the less you do. When I was teaching students, I was getting them to think about this sort of thing. I would say things like, well, if you think about the royal family, they're the most dependent people in the world because they don't do anything. I mean, only recently in the British press, which obviously won't get an eye on, but Prince Andrew can't even close his own curtains. He has to have a maid to do that. He doesn't choose his clothes. He doesn't wash his clothes. He doesn't do his cooking. He doesn't do his finances. He has people to do that. And that's usually the case. The more up the social scale you go, the more you depend on other people to do things that ordinary people, in inverted commas, do for themselves. So the argument that disabled people are some who use personal assistance are somehow different from everybody else is complete nonsense. And as I say, the more severely disabled you are, the more people you use to do everyday things. In one sense, you're an employer. I remember when in the 1980s, there was a politician, there was an explosion in one of the hotels down in the south of England, and one of the politicians' wife was severely disabled, and because of the bomb, basically, she had spinal injury, and he was asked by someone, a disabled person, how does your wife manage? And he said, well, she's got 4 nurses or 3 nurses that look after her. So in effect, that lady's impairment was giving employment to 3 people, which is quite normal for people who are, shall we say, financially or politically better off than everybody. So the idea that society provides services where needed is not unusual. And the social model independent living, in inverted commas, for disabled people is all about accessing those kind of supports, whatever form they take, basically. And of course, these ideas have had a lot of influence in lots of ways. It's unfortunate, of course, that since the economic crises that affected most countries in the late noughties, in the 2008 onwards, which incidentally was a financial crash that started in the USA, not in the UK or not in Ireland. If you look at the British political system, in 2005, the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and the Labour government produced a document which adopted a social model of disability, impairment related to personal issues such as walking, talking, or not walking, talking, not seeing, and so on. And disability was about social responses to people who acquired impairments, acknowledged impairments. And interestingly, they introduced a range of policies to change this. One of the most important of these was what was called a disability equality duty. And the idea was that every institution, organisation, public organisation, should have a 3-year programme to address barriers that they could afford to address. After 3 years, they would review what they'd done and identify more further barriers, so that you would have this rolling programme of changing society or organisational policies and practices so that it would become as accessible as possible. And of course, all that changed with the economic crash of the 2009-10. And of course, then the whole policies was scrapped, basically, because, in inverted commas, the country couldn't afford it and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that countries can afford these things given political action. Now, whether or not you need or want to get engaged in that kind of activism, that's a different story. But disabled people were, and some organisations, certainly in the UK and elsewhere across the world, are still engaged in those kind of activities. But every disabled activist can use ideas within the social model context to change everyday life for all disabled people that they know, and not just, in inverted commas, people who define themselves as disabled, because a lot of older people have impairments and they have difficulties and they are disabled by the situation that they find themselves in. That's why so many older disabled people end up in care homes, because their houses are not accessible, because they don't have personal assistants, and so on and so forth. All that could change with the kind of policies that some activists would argue for. Retired seriously in 2014. I'm still involved with various issues and disability organisations, and I do the odd thing. Since I started, in inverted commas, as a scholar and an academic, I've written something like 84 articles, edited and written, being responsible for the publication of 20 books And to be honest, I can't think of anything else that I can say that doesn't involve engaging with people who are in universities and academic institutions who want to argue for arguing's sake. Let's put it like this. There is the social model and disability politics is one of those approaches which is so simple and yet can be so complex for some people that they have to find other issues. For example, if you look at academic activity over the last 7 years, since the social model came into existence and became dominant within the disabled people's movement, you've had arguments against it. It doesn't engage with health and illness. Now that's nonsense, because obviously before you consider the social model, you have to accept the fact that illness and impairment are real issues. Nobody disputes the fact that people need health or impairment-related supports, basically. But a social model would argue, well, why don't people have access to these without finances, without money? I mean, one of the things that's often forgotten about health and social support in many countries is people have to pay. Increasingly in the UK, people are having to pay for services. Now, my argument would be a social model approach would attack the politics of health issues, meaning that health and services, doctors, medical services, should be free to those who need them. Do you see what I'm trying to say? But instead, get people who criticise, say, no, it's no good focusing on that. We need health services. Of course we need health services, but they're political arguments, and then you need a social model argument to make sure that they're provided. Another argument is talking about something called ableism. Okay? Now, ableism is an argument about saying, well, society is dominated by this idea that everybody's able-bodied. Well, the only way you can really understand that is coming at it from a disability point of view, a disabled people's point of view. But the argument they would argue is that, well, it doesn't include people, say, trans people. It doesn't include people with mental health issues. It doesn't. But of course it does, because one of the things that's important about the concept of impairment is it's not just something that's biological, it's a cultural issue. And it's important to remember that a century ago, women were perceived as, in inverted commas, different from men, not as intelligent as men. In other words, intellectually impaired. Gay people were seen as somehow biologically impaired, different. We don't accept that now. Now, my perspective is that all these people all these groups have been disabled in the same way that disabled people have been disabled and are still being disabled. So why do you need separate groups? The unfortunate thing about society is it's when arguments come forward, like the disabled people's movement, you get people with saying, well, it doesn't include this, and it doesn't include that, and it doesn't include the other. But if you go back to the writings of disability activists in the 1970s and 80s, people like Paul Hunt, like myself, like Vic Finkelstein, we were talking about society disabling people who are considered impairment or somehow biologically, intellectually different. And that's what disability is about. It's not about conditions. Conditions, and so many conditions, are created by doctors. There was a philosopher called Ivan Ilyich who talked about the way in which that medical science not only cures people, but creates illnesses. And there are many psychologists who argue that some of the psychological problems that we identify as problems today are part of everyday life. The most exciting thing that I ever wrote was cabbage syndrome. It was 1990, and that was basically my PhD thesis.
PhD, yeah.
Yeah, and it's at the time when I wrote that, interactionism, which was a sociological approach, which is about people understanding how people lived and worked and so on and so forth. It is about young people living in day centres, and it has things like comparisons between what non-disabled people can do and non-disabled people. I mean, there was a lovely woman who was a wheelchair user, and we had a day centre that was about 400 yards away from, or maybe longer, from the local library. And it would take me, as a non-disabled, in inverted commas, walker, about 5, 10, 15 minutes to get there. It would take Janet nearly half an hour to get there because she's a wheelchair user and she couldn't go in through the front door. She had to go through the service room at the back. You see what I mean? And all that's documented, and the different time involved and what we had to do to get there. That was the most exciting book. And then The Disabled People in Britain and Discrimination was 1991. I'd done some arguments about architecture, education and media in cabbage syndrome. But in 1989, the British Council of Disabled People, which was a national organisation of organisations controlled and run by disabled people, joined the campaign for anti-discrimination legislation. And they wanted a book or a report, that's all they asked for in the first place, on discrimination. And Richard Wood, who was the director of BCODP at the time, said we want it to focus on employment and education. And because I'd been and done what I'd done in the first place, I said, well, you can't understand employment and education without understanding transport, access, culture, everything about forces that shape employment and education. And that was they wanted it to have evidence. So I spent 89, 90 working on collecting data from government, comparing what non-disabled people had access to and disabled people had access to in terms of education, employment, services, benefits, housing, the media, everything. And I argued for a comprehensive approach to discrimination, because legislation alone will not solve the problem. Basically, it has to be a process, if you see what I mean. And that's what the book did. And those were the two, and everything else I've written, which has been arguing with sociologists and all that sort of stuff, that's all built around those two books for me. So, you could say, well, Barnes has just repeated himself for 14 years. Well, that's okay. As far as I'm concerned, that's fine. No, it's really from, if you read, there's my undergraduate dissertation on the archive in 1985, which has got barriers in there and all sorts of stuff. So all that was written, and all I did was elaborate on it and compare and argue with people who wanted to undermine the social model. And what's really interesting for me, of course, is that people such as, say, Tom Shakespeare, Dan Goodley, who've argued against the social model and end up talk about, well, it doesn't address this and it doesn't address that. When you see them on television or arguing about disability, they're using social model arguments. I was commissioned in 1991 to do a stereotype you know, the media stereotypes of disabled people. How disabled people or people with impairments are disabled by ideas and culture and stories. You know, disabled people are always either seen as pitiable, pathetic, or nasty and violent, so on. You could say it's changing now to some degree, but it's still there if you look hard enough. Mike didn't want to do it.
Oh, that's fair enough.
No, well, that's true, basically. I mean, Mike retired before me. And he, like me, he'd done so much, you end up just repeating yourself, basically. And everybody who comes up behind you, when I went to university, for example, I can speak on from my own perspective. When I went there was so much pressure to be up to date, you didn't look backwards, if you see what I mean. To look backwards, to look at what had gone before, you had to go outside the university. For example, when I went to university to do disability, there was nothing in the library by Mike Oliver to great extent. This was 1982. It wasn't until 1984 that I came across Mike Oliver's book, The Social Work and Disabled People, and an argument that formalised the social model, if you like. From that book, I discovered the Union of Physically Impaired and Segregation, which was outside the university's sphere of influence. I didn't know about Disabled People's International until I came across Mike Oliver and Vic Finkelstein and various others, none of whom worked inside universities. Well, that's how it was. I mean, yes. The only reason that Rob Towler, that's the bloke who interviewed me, gave me the job or gave me a studentship was because I was doing something that wasn't there inside the university. Robert Towler, if you like, was partly responsible for everything that Colin... You see, I've been very lucky because when I went to Leeds University, nobody else was doing disability. There was nobody to argue with, apart from sociologists who talked about interactions and stuff. And I could bring the work of Oliver, Finkelstein, Paul Hunt, people like that, into the university. In 1992, when I worked for BCODP between 1989 and 1992, but to supplement my income, because BCODP didn't have much money, you know, I was only paid low-paid researchers. I was teaching in the university, teaching sociology and teaching criminology and deviance at Trinity and All Saints in Horsham while I was working on the disability stuff. And when I finished the book on disability discrimination, the book on cabbage syndrome, I had 2 books published, and I got a research contract to do this work on the media. Now, the university at that time was under what they called a review, and they were reviewed whether they had any value or whether it was a good university by how many publications and what research was going on in departments. And of course, I got all this stuff published, so I was valuable to the university. And they gave me a 1-year contract. A 1-year contract, that's all I got to start with, from 1992. And I wanted to do something more than just teach sociology. So I put together a course on disability studies, which 2 key texts were Mike Oliver's Politics of Disablement, 1990, and Colin Barnes, 1991, Discrimination and Disabled People. Those were the 2 key texts that everybody had to read. And the rest of the stuff was taken from the literature reviews in Oliver and Barnes. basically. So we had that basis to start this course. But because I was only on a one-year contract, I couldn't teach. I couldn't be the course director in the university. So I had to recruit someone else, which was Jeff Mercer, who was my supervisor for my PhD. So that's how Jeff and I became colleagues, basically. The course was a success. So my contract was extended to 3 years, and then in 1994, I applied for a full-time job, and so on and so forth. You see, the BCODP put a research project together in 1990, which I was, and because I was teaching in the university, BCODP called Leeds University the British Council of Organisations People's Research Unit at the University of Leeds. So that gave publicity to the university. The university accepted that we had a disability research unit in the department. And of course, in 1993, we introduced a postgraduate course on disability studies. And originally, the postgraduate course was just going to be an introduction, basically, but students wanted more. That's why it became an MA course. And unlike other courses, the entry qualifications were either a first degree, equivalent professional qualifications, or relevant experience. And that relevant experience could come from being a disabled person going to special schools and stuff. Because in universities, you can get into other courses like engineering if you've had a lifetime's experience of engineering. So that was one easy way to get disabled people into the course. So we had various disabled people who've never been into an academic environment in their life enroll on the course. And I mean, Rachel Patel, for example, was one of the first students who came on the course without any formal academic qualifications. And now she works in health services down in Devon, where she lives. Liz Carr, you know, the actress, disabled actress who's in some TV program, she was one of our students as well at Leeds. And in 2008, we'd had something like 400 students going through the course in doing disability research, disability studies at postgraduate and undergraduate level. I was in the right place at the right time with the right ideas, that's all, basically. And because I was doing things that nobody else could do in the university, my father grew up in French Montreal in Canada, basically. He was taken over to Canada when he was 3 months old, and he had visual impairment like me, but he grew up in French-speaking Montreal. And one of the things he taught me as a child was, you know, you never stop. You don't take what he would say called bullshit from anybody. Do you know what I mean? When I was at university, I was convinced I knew what I was doing and nobody could argue with me. And it just, everything, disability studies grew and grew. Mike Oliver and Len Barton produced Disability Handicapping Society as it was as a journal in 1986, and I was asked to be on the editorial board of that. And of course, we introduced a new method of research, which meant disabled people should be involved in every element of disability research, and priority should be given to disabled researchers and stuff like that. We all did that because I was in the right place at the right time with the right people. Mike Oliver, Vic Finkelstein was a fellow at Leeds University for several years. I brought him in. Mike Oliver was an examiner on our courses. Len Barton was, various other people. Tom Shakespeare, for all his sins, was at Leeds between 1994 and 98, something like that. Mark Priestley, all these people. So I was lucky because I'd done it and people came in and so on and so forth.
But I think it's quite an exciting time in Ireland at the moment because the DPOs are finally being heard and our voices are getting through.
Well, Ireland is really big. I mean, going back to the DPI,
Mm.
in 1991, 92, if you go back and look at the evidence of the, because DPI adopted a social model definition of disability. You know that, don't you?
I do, but here in Ireland now, we're only getting to a stage now where finally the first government report that used the term disabled people was launched last week. We now have the National Housing Strategy for Disabled People, and that is a significant step forward in this country. So I think it is quite an exciting time, and as disabled people, our voices are finally getting in where they need to be.
Well, going back, just to go back to DPI, when Vic Finkelstein and various others, Richard Wood, went to the conference in South America, that conference was going to adopt initially the World Health Organization's then definition of disability, which was impairment, disability, and handicap. Okay, and it was Vic Finkelstein and an Irishman whose bloody name I can't remember, and I tried to look it up before I came to this talk today, who were responsible for getting the conference and DPI to adopt the two definitions of disability. And initially they adopted disability to go to the individual and handicap to be the social forces that shape disabled people's lives. But during the 80s and 90s, because according to lots of people, handicap was the problem in other countries, and that was the world that the majority of the world used. But over the 90s, that changed, and it was Disabled People's International in Europe that changed DPI's definition from disability and handicap to impairment and disability. So Ireland has got a big stake in changing it. But all this is forgotten, of course, because history is being rewritten by new academics. And it's really important that those of who are around remind people what has gone before, basically. Strengths to strategies for change in all organisations, because it's you and people like you will change the future and change disability studies.
So, Colin, I'm just wondering if you could think of one or two things you could say to everyone tonight, because we all want to influence change and we all want to make life better for every disabled person. What would they be? What would it be, in your experience?
Well, things have changed. I mean, things have changed. And the only way that things will change is by people like yourselves. The sad thing is that organisations like BCODP have now been absorbed into national charities. It's local organisations that will change, not national organisations. One of the things that was what happened to BCODP was that it was starved of funding, and the only way it could get funding was become part of, I think it's part of what used to be Rights Now, which was when the case for disability discrimination was proven in 1992, organisations like the then Spastic Society were all for discrimination legislation. That's what happened in 2006. Organisations that were previously charities who were not particularly pro-rights became rights organisations. But they're balanced between providing services and rights. And the only way that they get money is by providing services rather than political action. It's local organisations that will make changes. And when you go back to the history of disabled people's organisations during the 1980s, most of the organisations didn't have any financing, real finance. UPIS didn't have any real finance. There were people that came together without funding because of the issues that they were all aware of, if you see what I mean. So change will come from below rather than above. You know, I mean, you look at what's happening in the UK, it's, you know, terrible. Look what happened in 2011, 12 in the UK. You know, disabled people were being targeted as drains on the economy. I mean, there was a woman in Australia called Karen Solidatic who wrote a paper saying that the media coverage of disablement in that particular period resembled the kind of coverage that was put forward by the Nazis in the 1930s. Disabled people were a drain on society because of the resources that they used and so on and so forth. So politics can change very quickly. It's important that organisations, local organisations, are there and come together to make sure that there is opposition to those kind of changes. And to put forward the argument, disabilities are not just about so-called non-disabled people. It's about older people. Because older people, it's about people who consider themselves in long-term poor health. It's about change, making life accessible for people of all abilities. That's what disability politics is about.
So it's like making connections with other parts of society. And
there is a conference, if you want to go on the internet and have a look at an organisation which has just been set up by a colleague of mine at Leeds who's just about to retire, Simon Prideaux, Prideaux, right? He has put together a conference in an organisation called Injustice International. Injustice International. Now, that conference has got a disability stream in it, which I'm speaking at, but it's also got a stream on migration, on gender, on crime, on class, all the issues that are relative to people who are discriminated against in one way or another by a particular kind of society. I won't use the C word, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Capitalism.